Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to our friends tuning in from the Pacific region. My name is Camille Conda, the press attaché at the Embassy of France in the Philippines and Micronesia, and it is my honor to be your host today for this online celebration of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. The adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a truly historic moment in the global fight against climate change, where 196 parties agreed on a legally binding text to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and undertake efforts to limit it further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, we are joined by a geographically and thematically diverse lineup of speakers who will be highlighting several climate-related initiatives, particularly those that aim to support climate risk adaptation and mitigation in the Pacific region. To formally welcome everyone to this virtual event, I would like to introduce one of our co-hosts. A graduate of the Institute of Political Studies in Paris and the National School of Administration, French Ambassador Nicolas Gallet began his diplomatic career in 1988 and has since then been posted at the French Embassy in Algeria and in Egypt and at the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations in New York. After serving as Deputy Director at the Foreign Affairs Minister's Office, he was named Ambassador of France to Cyprus in 2007 and later became Middle East Advisor at the Diplomatic Office of the French Presidency from 2009 to 2012. Prior to his arrival in the Philippines in December 2017, he was French Ambassador to Egypt and Interministerial Delegate to the Mediterranean. Please welcome Ambassador of France to the Philippines and non-resident Ambassador to the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, His Excellency Mr. Nicolas Gallet.
Good morning, everybody. Honorable Minister Nemra, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the colleagues, the German Ambassador Riefenstiel and EU Ambassador Seam, UNDP representative Levan Bouadze, dear friends of the RMI, fellow representative of the international community, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome all of you today, together with my German colleague, on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. I'm glad to see the diversity of speakers that are gathered today and who are going to join us from either here in Manila or from Suva in Fiji, from Nouméa in New Caledonia, or of course from Majuro in the Marshall Islands. This diversity shows that climate change is a challenge for everyone, everywhere. It's only by working all together that we can build a better future for the planet. Exactly 5 years ago, near Paris, 195 countries and the EU adopted a historic agreement dealing with greenhouse gas emission mitigation, climate change adaptation, and green finance. But the 5th anniversary of this agreement is not only an opportunity to keep in mind and celebrate what has already been achieved, but also to call for action. For under the Paris Agreement, all state parties must set out their climate ambitions as quickly as possible and by COP26 in 2021. Even if fully implemented, the National Determined Contribution, the NDCs, set out in 2015, would still lead to global warming of over 3 degrees Celsius, far from the objectives of the agreement, plus 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Nowadays, with the COVID-19 crisis, the call to step up ambitions in the fight against climate change is struggling to be heard. Later on today, the UN, France, the UK, Chile, and Italy will co-host virtually the Climate Ambition Summit, which will be a major chance to put the climate back at the heart of the global agenda. But now, in different parts of the Pacific, we're happy to celebrate this 5th anniversary with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, a country which is particularly vulnerable to the impact of global warming and whose leaders have been remarkably and constantly engaged in supporting the Paris Agreement. The RMI was indeed the very first signatory to revise its NDC as early as November 2018. A country which also participated in many climate change-related initiatives in multilateral fora. Let me pay here tribute to the memory of Tony de Broom, a major and renowned Marshallese figure whose role was so exemplary in this regard. Dear participants, during the last 48 hours, as we were approaching this anniversary, two important events have been the occasion for significant statements and decisions. One from the European Union, which my German colleague will mention in more details, and the Pacific Island Forum, where leaders of the region expressed in strong words their very deep concerns regarding the lack of implementation of the Paris Agreement commitments in many parts of the world. I therefore believe that I could not conclude better than by quoting one of the participants in the PIF meeting, who said, "We all signed the Paris Agreement, now let's insist we put it to work. It's past time to get serious." I think all of us can share this statement, and I wish again to express our deep appreciation for the determination of the Marshall Islands to continue to be an unwavering advocate of the Paris Agreement. You can count on us to support your efforts. Thank you again for taking part in this event. I wish you fruitful discussions. Merci, thank you. Komol tata.
Merci beaucoup, Ambassadeur. Indeed, today's event is not only an opportunity to recall the progress achieved in the last 5 years, but is also a call to further raise the level of ambition in the fight against climate change. Please allow me now to introduce our next speaker. Ambassador Ank-Reif van Stuel has worked in the German diplomatic service since 1993 and has been posted in the German embassies in London, New Delhi, and Cairo. Prior to her designation as ambassador at the German Embassy in Manila in August 2019, she was head of the Division of Humanitarian Assistance and Operations at the Directorate General for Humanitarian Assistance, Crisis Prevention, Stabilization, and Post-Conflict Reconstruction of the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. For her welcome remarks, I now give the screen to Her Excellency, Ms. Ank-Reif van Stuel, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Philippines.
Good morning, everyone. Honorable Minister Nemra, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, dear colleagues, French Ambassador Nicolas Gallet and EU Ambassador Serge, dear friends of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, fellow representatives of the international community, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's event on climate change, an issue of increasing importance for all of us, and to do this together with my friend and colleague Nicolas Gallet, the French ambassador. I commend the French government for its achievement at the Paris Climate Summit 5 years ago. It was heavy negotiations until the agreement could finally be signed. And I still remember that the German Minister for Environment had tears in her eyes when the agreement was reached. Tears of joy over this ambitious achievement. Much has happened since then. The Fridays for Future movement has done enormous awareness raising and led to an engaged involvement of the young generation. Since the Paris Agreement, a highly and truly committed political process to address climate change has taken place at a global level. And only yesterday, one day before today's UN summit, the EU has agreed on a new ambitious target on a 55% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. In order to achieve this objective, efforts in all relevant sectors will be involved in this joint European endeavor. This includes transport, industry, farming and forests, as well as energy. The proposals also include that aviation, shipping and maritime transport will have to step up their climate-related efforts. In this regard, I would like to commend the government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to its second NDC, committing to ambitious climate targets. The Marshall Islands also is the only country that has made self-commitments on reducing emissions in the shipping sector. I am proud that the German government supports this ambitious endeavor by financing a project on low-carbon sea transport. To reiterate our commitment, the German government has decided to increase the project funding by 1.5 million euro. The countries of the Pacific region, like the Marshall Islands, have seen a constant rise of climate change-related challenges over the past years. Climate change is a challenge that can only be addressed successfully when working together. Therefore, it is encouraging to have so many committed and knowledgeable speakers and government representatives of the Pacific Island region, experts and stakeholders participating in today's event. The Paris Agreement is a historic milestone of international efforts to combat climate change. Climate change, being one of the most pressing challenges today, continues to be a political priority for the European Union. Before the background of the current COVID pandemic, the European Union recently also adopted the EU Green Deal, a climate-responsible economic recovery package that provides a roadmap for Europe becoming a climate-neutral continent by 2050. Germany has long been a strong advocate for combating climate change. In 2018, we launched, in the UN context, the Multilateral Group of Friends on Climate and Security, an initiative many European as well as Pacific Island states have joined, including the Marshall Islands, making this a joint endeavor. Also, in our recently adopted Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, Germany underlines its commitment to combat climate change in the Indo-Pacific region, which is most severely hit by the effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, and increase in extreme weather events. Let me close by thanking the French Embassy in Manila for organizing this event. I wish the participants, I wish you a fruitful exchange and discussions. Thank you.
Vielen Danke, Madam Ambassador. Germany has indeed been an important actor at the forefront of the global climate effort alongside France and the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands has consistently been at the front lines of the fight against climate change. Today's online celebration seeks to highlight this commitment. Please allow me now to introduce our representative from the Marshall Islands to deliver his welcome remarks. Honorable Casten Nemra was appointed the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the Republic of the Marshall Islands in January 2020. Minister Nemra was re-elected to the 33-membership Parliament following the November 2019 national elections, representing Jaluit Atoll for the term of 4 years. Minister Nemra first entered the Parliament in 2016 and was elected as the 7th President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. He is currently a member of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Standing Committee on Appropriations. Minister Nemra has extensive background in the civil service, where he previously served as the Chief Secretary from 2008 to 2015, which heads the public service and is the Chief Advisory Officer of the government to the Cabinet. Prior to his role of Chief Secretary, Minister Nemra served as the Assistant Secretary for the Ministry of Finance from 2004 to 2007 and the Budget Director for the Office of International Development Assistance from 2001 to 2004. Though he's not here to join us today for this online celebration, Minister Nemra shares with us a few words through the following video message.
Greetings and yoga. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this roundtable with you today on the historic anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement. The Republic of the Marshall Islands has always valued the close collaboration of the European Union, UNDP, France, and Germany in addressing the global climate change challenges. Reflecting back 5 years ago, the Paris Agreement would not have been able to come into form without the active engagement of this group in particular. The work of the High Ambition Coalition and the Climate Vulnerable Forum leading up to the Paris Agreement's adoption was an integral part to securing many of the most defining elements, including the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal and the ramping up of the NDCs every 5 years. I appreciate the first objective of this meeting is to put back climate at the heart of the collective agenda. And I'm confident that we will achieve this objective ahead of COP26. It is therefore imperative that we set the stage for 2021 to be a year of action and a year of fulfilled promises. The Marshall Islands has always been living up to the commitments we made. Although we have negligible emissions, we are committed to achieving low carbon future, formulating our low emission development strategy to achieve net zero by 2050 and our national adaptation plan to protect the survival and the sovereignty of our country. We are very proud indeed to have been the first country to submit its enhanced NDCs. But our collective future, however, depends on the world's ability to live up to the commitments agreed in Paris. Our action alone cannot mitigate the impacts of climate change. Action from every single country is the key and essential. We therefore commend other countries that have also delivered their enhanced NDCs and welcome those that have omitted to deliver before the COP26. To achieve the promises of the Paris Agreement, it is urgent that we come together to implement ambitious action in high-emitting sectors like aviation and shipping. We applaud France for attaching green condition to building its airline industry. It is also essential that France and partners alike follow suit with similar measures. The same could be done with international shipping fleet to pave the way for the use of zero carbon ships and other GHG reducing technologies. With the RMI owning one of the largest registries in the world, we, along with other Pacific Island countries, are also actively engaged through the International Maritime Organization to promote policies that can reduce emission in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius emission trajectory, particularly carbon pricing initiatives. We also recognize that success in achieving the Paris Agreement goals will also require us to seize the unprecedented opportunity posed by COVID-19 and the economic recovery that is already underway. If we are to stay within reach of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to collectively commit to recovery processes that ensure that our people and the planet are healthier, safer, and more resilient. This is why earlier this year, we worked very hard with fellow members of the High Ambition Coalition to outline a variety of economic and environmental commitments to set a high bar for recovery efforts. Through the Statement on Resilient Recovery, members are calling for 60% of domestic recovery spending to be climate friendly, a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, and debt relief and adequate resources for developing countries to ensure that all can build back effectively. Unfortunately, the action we need to take requires financing, and the financing is not sufficient. The promises of 100 billion by 2020 this year has not been met, and loans continue to make up the grand majority of climate financing. The challenges of rebuilding our economies and preserving our future by mitigating climate change is already a significant one, and doing so under the burden of debt makes it even harder for developing nations and small island states like ours. If development funding is sacrificed on the altar of short-term political and economical interest, it is not only the developing states that will suffer, but also the trust and collaboration with each which we secured during the historic Paris Agreement. As we look towards the future of the Paris Agreement and green recovery efforts, I have no doubt that this group will answer the call for bold leadership and help to ensure that 2021 is indeed a year of action and fulfilled promises. Thank you, and komotara.
And with that, our virtual celebration of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement is officially open. We have a very dense program ahead, so without further ado, let us begin our institutional roundtable discussion. We'll be beginning with Ms. il-Kijiner, who is a climate envoy of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Ms. Kathy?
I'm really fortunate to be here today. Today I'm happy to be sharing a poem that I wrote recently for the Climate Vulnerable Forum new campaign called the Midnight to Survival campaign. The Marshall Islands has been doing a lot of important technical work on developing our national adaptation plan. And our national adaptation plan is meant to be human-centered, human rights focused, to have a major component that is human rights focused. And we've been with a gender analysis also. And we're trying to make sure that it has a self-determination lens as well. We have a lot of values that's guiding the work that we're doing, and a part of it really is making sure that our community is as much a part of the process, a bottom-up approach, rather than having someone from the outside come in and write the entire thing for us. We believe that we need to ensure that our citizens have as much of a part of the process as anybody else. And so this is why we've been pushing more for adaptation focus and adaptation support. So as a cultural ambassador with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, I've been trying to ensure that a lot of the writing and the work that I do in the arts also focuses on the aspects of adaptation and raising awareness on the work that we're doing out here. A really important component for us in as much as that an important part of my messaging has been that we're not just sitting here waiting for handouts. We're not sitting here waiting and being victims. We're actually doing the work on the ground. And I think across the Pacific and across the region, we can really say that, we have national teams that are working against the clock. So the Midnight Survival campaign is a campaign that the CVF has been pushing, where we are encouraging countries to submit their NDCs by December 31st midnight. It's a survival deadline. And so this poem was written partially to contribute towards that campaign. Another part of the poem is also inspired by Tony de Broom. Tony de Broom is our former climate ambassador and foreign minister who passed away. And he, what some people say is that he helped grandfather the Climate Paris Agreement. He was there and representing both the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition, and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and did a lot of work in putting together important coalitions and ensuring 1.5 degrees in the agreement. And so this poem is just as much also commemorating him and the work of our national level teams. So this is called Midnight. So I'll just read the piece to open our event today. And I look forward to hearing from all of the speakers. And I thank again the organizers for including me in the program. For Tony, we'll say, for Tony. Corals are resilient, I've been told, and so are we. We've survived worse. Just ask your elders, they'll lift their shirts, show you bunker scars, typhoon tent towns, atomic nightmares of lost irradiated islands. So this is just another incoming tide to shore up against. Hence seawalls, hence foreign aid, hence consultants, terms of references, a framework for asking each other, which island will we move to? Which island will be hit first? Which island is worth salvaging? The wreck, a slow-moving accident, the ultimate disaster, atolic oblivion. As if we haven't experienced this before, as if we haven't been told that evacuation is safer. You'll come home someday. 2030, 2040, long-term versus short-term. We debate this around the table. We do the work, submit reports, but we are short on time. Before the clock strikes midnight, before the pumpkin rots, before our glass island shatters. Are we so easily broken? Maybe we need flags to tell us how afraid we should be. We have flags for COVID threat levels, yellow for safe, yellow for prepare, yellow for complacency, yellow worth celebrating, COVID free. The US is celebrating, part of it anyway. They are dancing in the street and kissing babies because celebrations are worthy, because the US will be back in the Paris Treaty, because it feels like multiple breaths taken at once, like bubbles bursting through reefs. We reassemble ourselves. We gather the calcium carbonate to grow our coral skeletons into sunlight. Look, up ahead, a lush marine garden awaits. For Tony, we'll say. For Tony. Thank you.
Okay. That very beautiful tribute to Tony de Broom, which really does capture the spirit and the experience of the Marshall Islands and your commitment to the fight against climate change. So thank you for sharing that. And we move on now to the next part of our program. I introduce our next speaker. Mr. Levan Bouadze assumed the role of resident representative for the United Nations Development Program Pacific Office in Fiji in July 2019. He was previously assigned at the UNDP headquarters in New York, first as chief of the Management Support Unit of the Bureau for External Relations and Advocacy, and later as chief of Planning and Operations Support of the Regional Bureau for Europe and Central Asia. He started working at the United Nations in his native Georgia in 1996, where he served as National Program Officer at UNDP Georgia, and later assumed various roles in the UNDP's offices in Bratislava, Uzbekistan, and Belarus. Earlier in his career, he also held various positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia from 1992 to 1996. Now to tell us more about the work of the UNDP, please welcome Mr. Levan Bouadze.
Thank you, Camila. I just want to make sure that my voice is heard.
Yes, you're very clear. Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, hi. So, yeah, good morning to all of you, colleagues. Well, I prepared, or rather, colleagues helped me to prepare my intervention with this being a speech and with all the protocols mentioned and indicated. So since we are in a virtual space and some colleagues are missing, maybe I'll skip the protocol part if that's okay with you and go straight into what the message of my speech is today. So clearly, we recognize that today we celebrate the 50th year anniversary of Paris Agreement, and we all know, and Camille, you mentioned yourself what it is all about and what ambition there is. I think we all have to emphasize how ambitious and how challenging that task and ambition is, and I mean, it requires all of us to come together to make sure that at least we achieve 2% target and ideally 1.5%. And in this connection, I think the United Nations system, including it's one of the development arms such as UNDP, we do our share and contribute the way we can. So in fact, and like you mentioned, we are not really present in Marshall Islands other than the project staff, which lately, due to COVID, we are not even able to field with all the restrictions that are in place. But we try to support our countries remotely. But when it comes to NDCs, I think I'm pleased to report to you that out of 15 countries in the Pacific, 8 countries we support in developing an NDC, nationally determined contributions work, and we believe that we are going to make much progress in this respect, and just then see some renewed commitment from the countries of the Pacific. And we have to particularly recognize Marshall Islands as being one of the leaders, although in Marshall Islands we don't necessarily support the NDCs as far as UNDP is concerned, but we are also, there is a significant climate portfolio that we have, we believe in the Marshall Islands, that we support indirectly to that exercise. As far as the countries are concerned, the 8 countries that I mentioned, those are Cook Islands, Kiribati, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Samoa, and Tonga. And this all comes under so-called our Climate Promise Initiative, and we do so in close collaboration with the Pacific Regional NDC hub. And when I mentioned the Marshall Islands, in Marshall Islands we support specifically NDC support program to deepen efforts in accelerated NDC implementation per se. So what is important is that I think I have to emphasize here that we are working. I just want to emphasize and acknowledge the work associated with the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, FRDP, along with the Pacific Resilience Partnership, PRFP, which provide very good basis for our climate's resilient development. While taking action on climate change, it is equally important to use a gender lens and zoom in on communities and grassroots who have very limited access to transport and essential services, including access to electricity and water. These communities live in remote locations, and it is important that they are consulted and become the focus, so they benefit the most from all the work. In this connection, a few weeks ago, UNDP organized a webinar on gender and climate action for Pacific Island countries, where we learned about how the NDC aspirations can be practically applied into concrete actions that make sense to and benefit the communities and grassroots. Our efforts must also be inclusive of the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, as they are the frontline victims of the impact of climate change. And now the context, as we all know, we are in the COVID-19 times, unpredictable. Clearly, what's ahead, and also something that we really haven't prepared ourselves for. And it just creates and poses another additional challenge. And in the Pacific, COVID-19's impact mostly is on economies, and this has been so far substantial. And it affects a number of sectors such as tourism, aviation, and transport. COVID-19 has also impacted climate financing in many ways, and where governments and development partners alike are forced to divert budgets for COVID-19 response away from climate financing. In this situation, we need more effort to harness climate finance from different sectors, including private sector, trust funds, and other bilateral and multilateral funds. Hence, reshaping our development work towards green recovery is a key opportunity of the NDC enhancement process. And to conclude, I would like to highlight the remarks recently given by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in climate action to European Council on Foreign Relations. So according to him, by early 2021, countries representing more than 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions and more than 70% of the world economy will have made ambitious commitments to carbon neutrality, but we are still running behind in the race against time, and every country, city, financial institution, and company should adopt plans for transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050. So that's what his statement was. So I guess in closing, I would like to say that UNDP is dedicated to supporting the Republic of Marshall Islands with climate action. And in the second half of this session, you will hear from my colleague Vinny about some of the initiatives we are working on here in the Marshall Islands. Komultata. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bouadze, and thank you for sharing in general terms the work of the UNDP. Yes, it's true that we do need to increase support for climate action mitigation and adaptation, especially for the most vulnerable countries and populations. And we see how all these development issues are tied together, from climate to gender to health to socioeconomic development. And yes, as Mr. Levan mentioned, we will be knowing more about the specific programs of the UNDP in the Pacific. So with that, we move on to our next speaker. He's not able to join us this morning, but we're We're happy to have with us Ms. Erja Askola, the Deputy Head of the European Union Delegation for the Pacific, to deliver the remarks on behalf of His Excellency Sujiro, Ambassador of the European Union for the Pacific. Yes,
Good
Ms. Erja,
morning.
the floor is yours.
Good morning. Yes, yes. Now I see my own face on the screen, so that's always a good sign. Hello, everybody. Good morning from Nandi, Fiji. It's afternoon actually here, but I know that it's morning in other parts of the world. Let me go directly into the subject matter because I know we have limited time available. So the EU and the Pacific have been strong allies in the area of fighting against climate change. Our cooperation has in fact been instrumental in the run-up to the Paris Agreement itself. I don't think that we would have ever achieved such an ambitious agreement without the strong alliance the EU and Pacific ACP countries had. I'm underlying the ACP context in this because indeed we have a long tradition of cooperation between the Pacific countries within the Cotonou Agreement already, and we will be going on in this cooperation under the successor agreement of the Cotonou that will be coming into life next year, hopefully. A thing that I would like to say on the EU side of the coin specifically is that we have 25 years of climate action. I would say successful climate action behind us. By 2019, the EU emissions were down by 24% from 1990 levels, and that is significant. In the same period, the EU combined GDP has grown by about 60%. So this means that in relative terms, our emissions have been increasing quite well. Also in a global perspective, in relative terms, our emissions have been falling. The EU was the first major economy to endorse climate neutrality objective by 2050 and to officially communicate it to the United Nations in March this year. We were joining Fiji and Marshall Islands in this ambition, and we're indeed very happy to do so. At the same time, the EU has launched a so-called European Green Deal, a new growth model and roadmap to achieve climate neutrality in the EU by 2050, as I mentioned, as well as a strategy to bring together environmental, economic, and social sustainability. 10 months into the strategy, we are aligning our policies in areas ranging from energy to industry to farming, food, transport, innovation, biodiversity, with our sustainability goals. There is also a draft EU climate law under consideration and in the making at the moment to anchor these climate neutrality goals into our legislation. The EU and member states, its member states, 27 member states currently, remain strongly committed to this existing climate finance goals, while stressing the importance of continuous progress across entire climate finance landscape. The EU already contributes quite heavily to the global goals and to the global funds. The EU and its member states are the largest contributor of public climate finance to developing countries. Together, this so-called Team Europe, EU and its member states and financial institutions contributed around 21.9 billion euros, which is roughly equivalent to around 27 billion US dollars to the climate finance in developing countries. This is a 7.4 increase compared to the previous year, and it's more than double if we compare it to the levels 7 years ago. In the Pacific, in the ACP Pacific again, specifically, with the European Union has been a key partner in the region, supporting the climate ambition and adaptation needs of small island states. We support, among others, relocation of vulnerable communities, energy sector reforms, ocean governance, recovery efforts in the aftermath of tropical cyclones. By the way, in Fiji, there is a bit of a warning at the moment of a tropical cyclone. So yesterday we didn't even dare to take the plane to come to Nandi from Suva. Luckily, nothing has happened so far. After this little parenthesis, just let me conclude by first of all saying that the European Union has invested over 200 million euros, which is around 243 million US dollars to climate resilience and environmental programs in the last years. And looking beyond 2020, we would like to bring the transformation impact of the European Green Deal to the Pacific and propose a green-blue alliance between the European Union and the Pacific. But let me make my last point on our support programs in this context, specifically with the Marshall Islands. We have a budget support program of around 9 million US dollars on renewable energy under implementation. We also have a specific program to build resilience to climate-related drought in Marshall Islands. This is part of a broader regional program called North Pacific Readiness for El Niño project, which we are implementing with the Pacific community. This is a significant program. It's very interesting from the perspective of food security, and women have a very essential role in this initiative from the perspective of I would say gardening, cooking, vegetable growing, and all these kind of things. So let me just conclude by this remark. This alliance between the Pacific and the EU in the combat against climate change is stronger and stronger, and we will certainly go on well beyond the current Cotonou Agreement into the successor agreement next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erja, for delivering the message of Ambassador Sujiro and for sharing the climate agenda of the EU, whose actions serve as an example for others to step up their own respective climate ambitions. And so this concludes our institutional roundtable. We now move on to the next part of our program, which will provide a more technical discussion on the climate-related challenges and solutions in the Pacific. To begin our expert panel, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Ms. Sara Jane Ahmed currently serves as the V20 Finance Advisor for the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the Climate Vulnerable Group of 20 Ministers of Finance. She developed and currently leads V20 initiatives such as the V20's Accelerated Financing Mechanism and the CVF's Energy Track Work. Previously an investment advisor specializing in originating and structuring energy opportunities, Sara provides advisory support to governments, development banks, UN agencies, and private and nonprofit groups on climate finance, resilience, and energy transition investment strategies in developing countries. She has steered efforts in energy transition in the Philippines and Bangladesh as an energy finance analyst with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. To tell us more about the work of the V20, particularly in economic resilience and climate finance, please welcome Ms. Sara Jane Ahmed.
Thank you, Camille. And if I could get my slide on the screen, please. Great, thank you. So the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the CVF, is a group of 48 vulnerable developing countries to drive global ambition towards climate action. In 2015, just 2 months before the Paris Agreement, under the CVF presidency of the Philippines, was the creation of the vulnerable group of 20 ministers of finance to translate the political ambition into real economy outcomes. The current presidency of the CVF and the V20 is Bangladesh. The Marshall Islands was the previous presidency and remains in the troika of the CVF and the V20. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the current pandemic has put an incredible strain on CVF and V20 economies, simultaneously riddled by natural hazards such as typhoons, hurricanes, and flooding. The most vulnerable people are put at even more risk. 2020 has been a record-breaking year for natural disasters, and breaching the 1.5-degree threshold may reverse hard-fought development gains. During the week of the UN General Assembly, the CVF heads of state called for staying on track and updating NDCs by the midnight survival deadline for climate at the end of this year. It is critical that 2020 is seized and not pushed off to 2025 in order to safeguard the 1.5-degree limit and maximize. The current CVF V20 presidency, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, has called for the development of climate prosperity plans, being the first country to deliver this in March 2021. These plans are being tabled across the membership, including the Pacific, and is an opportunity for partners such as the EU and the UN development agencies to respond to CVF V20 member countries' urgent needs for attracting new investments to drive prosperity throughout the coming decade on the front lines of the global climate emergency. Next slide, please. So the V20 agenda is straightforward. To catalyze economic transformation among member states by enabling effective access to climate finance and mobilize a far stronger response from the economic and finance community to scale up investments for climate action across the membership. Priorities include overcoming cost of capital constraints, dampening climate action and ambition. So the V20 mandated the UN Environment Programme to study the link between the cost of capital and climate change. And the study found that V20 countries pay 10% more in capital costs due to climate vulnerability. So for every $10 paid in interest payments, an extra $1 is paid due to climate vulnerability. High cost of capital negatively affects the project economics of investments with high upfront costs such as renewable energy and adaptation infrastructure. For example, if you see the graph here, the one in blue, we find that the difference between 5% and 10% interest rate is the difference between paying over twice as much over the project period due to the cost of financing. So in Majuro alone, there is at least $7 million of investment opportunity in the power sector, not to mention the job opportunities it brings with it, along with cost savings as a result of reduced import diesel use. An impediment to this is both access to upfront capital and the cost of capital, which is certainly solvable with climate finance and de-risking. One of the finance mobilization initiatives include the accelerated financing mechanisms of the V20, which aims to buy down the cost of capital by reducing interest rates and extending financing terms through de-risking instruments such as guarantees. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to highlight that international development partners typically rely on the neatness of the logic when it comes to program design. But the closer we get to the ground and the closer we get to implementation, the realization comes that existing design or the architecture may not fit the realities on the ground and may not align the incentives appropriately. This is where the CVF and the V20 members must be part of the solutions building process. Next slide, please. So the CVF and V20 climate prosperity plans enable building back better, as they are strategic investment frameworks to mobilize financing, especially through international cooperation for implementing renewable energy and resilience projects. The plans include an analysis of jobs created, cost savings as a result of shifting to renewable energy, health savings, disaster reduction, preparedness, and risk transfer measures, as well as foreign direct investment opportunity and consequent tax revenue growth potential that would be realized if projects in the plans are financed and implemented. The stimulus packages on their own will not create a stimulus, but resilience will. The objective thus must be resilience spending instead of just stimulus spending. And the clear lesson from the pandemic is that we need a new economic goal, one that CVF and V20 countries should be familiar with. So it's not just growth. The yardstick needs to be based on resilience objectives. The point of these CVF and V20 climate prosperity plans is a reorientation of development finance and leveraging of economic cooperation, sovereign resources, domestic finance, and a clear appreciation of carbon markets as a financing option, and of course, private sector. In summary, global leadership from developing countries can translate into ambition and opportunities for an economic transformation. Much of the development work and energy planning is supply driven. So to shift decisively, developing country governments must be empowered to shift the economic vision. Climate prosperity plans cannot be realized without shared leadership, just as the global goals of the Paris Agreement cannot be accomplished without vulnerable country leadership. So we look forward to shared leadership between the EU and the CVF members throughout a strategic investment agenda, which can boost planetary prosperity and tackle frontline climate threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara, for telling us more about the actions and the aspirations of the CVF and the V20. It's indeed important that climate resilience, the transition to clean energy and the like must be integrated in countries' economic plans, particularly with the help of climate finance in order to achieve truly sustainable and inclusive growth and development. So now we move on to the next speaker in our expert panel. Dr. Winfereti Nainoca has been with the United Nations Development Program Pacific Office since 2012 and currently serves as its environmental specialist and team leader ad interim for the Resilience and Sustainable Development Team, covering climate change mitigation and adaptation, disaster management, renewable and efficient energy, and environmental conservation and management. Prior to joining the UNDP, Dr. Nainoca was the head and lecturer of the School of Applied Science at the Fiji Institute of Technology, which is now part of the Fiji National University. She completed her master's degree in environmental science with honors at the University of Wollongong in Australia, and her PhD in environmental conservation at Massey University in New Zealand. Please welcome Dr. Winfereti Nainoca.
Thank you very much, Camille, and dear Bulavinaka from Fiji. Happy to be here, and Kathy, I must say that your poem moved me a bit to tears, and I confess I already saw it on Facebook last night with a video, very impressive. So thank you very much, Kathy. And also, Camille, can I stop looking at my face on the screen? And thank you, Camille. Okay, thank you. So, you know, we're celebrating now, but we've been celebrating for the last 5 years because the Paris meeting was, I feel, one of the best in which we move forward with the hope that things will change, and it's still continuing. So can we go on to the next slide, please, Camille? Thank you. So as Levan was saying, the UNDP Pacific Office, we support 9 countries. And of course, with our regional programs, we support another 5 countries. So altogether for the 14 Pacific Island countries. And there's 3 offices in the Pacific. We have the Pacific office in Suva, that serves 9 countries plus the sub-office in the Solomon Islands. And then we have the Samoa multi-country office that covers Samoa, Niue, Cook Islands, and Tokelau, and of course the Papua New Guinea country office. Thank you, Camille. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for our UNDP climate action in RMI, I'm going to just very briefly go over these 5 projects, even though what is not covered here is the regional projects. That, for instance, if you see the 4th bullet point down, we have the Reach to Reef, which is what we do with RMI, specifically a country project, but we also have the regional Reach to Reef that UNDP as implementing agency for GEF had asked the SPC to implement, execute the regional 10 million project for the 14 Pacific Island countries. So we'll go to the first of our projects, the Nationally Determined Contribution Deep Dive. So next slide, please, Camille. So for the deep dive, it's a short form for deepening the efforts to accelerate NDC implementation. As you have heard from Kathy, they are really serious about this NDC. So the first country in the world to submit a second NDC in November 2018 was actually RMI. So this intervention here, we are supporting, and thankfully with all the funding that you can see all these lovely symbols and logos at the bottom, the European Union there, the German government and the Spanish. They are all supporting us for this particular project. We are so fortunate that the working group for Working Group for Climate Change and Resilience Coordination is also the chair of that, the in-country facilitator for that is also our project manager for this particular project. And for this project, we are supporting the 6 priority outcomes towards achieving the NDC targets of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So there's 6 priority outcomes for the government, and through this project, 1.62 million for 2 years, we are supporting the priority outcomes of RMI's NDC's partnership plan. Thank you. Next slide, please, Camille. The other one we are supporting the Marshall Islands for is the acronym is TNC BOR, which is the Third National Communication and Biennial Update Report, in which we support Marshall Islands for its reporting obligations to the UNFCCC. And as you can see, this is the 3rd. We were also fortunate to be able to support this enabling activity for RMI for the 2nd national communication. And hopefully when this TNC is over, we will be able to also support Marshall Island for its FNC, the 4th national communication. So what happens over here is that by 2022, we hope to support this 3rd national communication. And of course, as you can see in number 2, the other output is that 14 experts, and we are targeting at least 50% women from relevant ministry and agencies to be involved in the preparation of these reports, the 2 reports of TNC and FBUR, so that we are building capacity in terms of climate change measurement and reporting in the Marshall Islands. And in the same way, 30 experts, at least 15 women from all the stakeholder groups, academia, civil society, and business sphere will increase their knowledge. The total on climate change. The total resource is 852,000 US dollars, and it runs for 4 years. The donor is Jeff Trust Funds. Thank you, Camille. Next slide, please. The Aqua project, Aqua is to ensure that the water security, ensure water security by providing at least 20 liters per capita per day for residents, especially in the outlying islands. So we are targeting 24 atolls. So what we are going to do here, together with the executing agency, which is the EPA, 3 main outputs. One, it's implementation of optimal mix of interventions to ensure climate resilience, water security. So when we're talking about a mix of intervention, it could be bettering the roof and the catchment of probably the meeting houses in the village, or the schools or community buildings. And also for the, apart from that, we can look at the groundwater, where there is groundwater boreholes to better it and make it more safe and better in terms of water quality for the residents of the outer islands. The second one is optimization of alternative water sources to reduce reliance on harvested rainwater, especially in the parts of the Marshall Islands, the islands that are sitting on the drier parts that have reduced rainfall. And output 3 is climate change induced drought preparedness and response measures in being implemented in these outer islands and atolls. The funding total is 24.7 million, and we are so thankful to the government of RMI that they provided a cash co-financing of 6 million towards together with 18.6 million GCF grant. Thank you so much, government of RMI, for your vision. And the duration of this implementation is 7 years. It just started this year and it will complete in 2027. Thank you, Camille. Next one, please. This is a government of Japan funded project for the Marshall Islands. It's 7.4 million. And EDCR, another acronym, is to effectively address the consequences of and responses to geophysical and climate-related hazards in order to, again, protect lives, sustain livelihoods, preserve the environment, and safeguard the economy. As you can see there, there's a drawing of the building there, and that is specifically part of output 2. Output 2, which says over there, enhance national and state disaster responders readiness capacity and better resource to minimize loss of lives and damages. What you see here is a building, an example of one of the 2 buildings that this project is going to build. The construction of the National Emergency Operations Center, EOC, on Majuro, and that is the building that you see right there. And the other one is the construction of the Emergency Operations Center in Ibai. So we are so thankful to the government of Japan for providing this funding. And of course, Within these buildings, there'll be, apart from the building itself, there'll be efforts for output one, which is the strengthening the disaster communication and climate monitoring systems, which includes something as simple as chat beetles in 9 locations, and we will have about 3 spares, and providing wave rider buoys that will support wave modeling and real-time inundation forecasting. Next one, please, Camille. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I think we may have slipped one, but it's okay. We must have skipped one, which is plate number 7, but that is okay. I'll just talk about it now instead of going back through the slides. This is about the R2R, the Reach to Reef, where we are targeting. It's a funding from Jeff, from the Jeff 5 allocation of Marshall Islands. So it is for targeting 5 islands. Yes, there it is. Camille, I know you want to take your Saturday off. So we'll just look at this. I won't read everything. We are doing this in a different way by giving you some achievements on work that is already happening for the 5 targeted islands. And that is Woto, Mejit, Likiat, Ibon, and Aura. Those are the 5 islands that are 5 sites that are targeted for this work. And Camille will be able to share this slide with all of us later. And you can see just some of the achievements there. This is a 5-year project. This is 3.9 million from Global Environment Facility. It started in 2017 and it will be finishing in 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Yes, thank you very much. It's encouraging to know that the UNDP is taking a number of effective and concrete efforts to support the implementation of the NDCs of the Marshall Islands. Okay, so now we move on to our next speaker. Serge Andréfouët is a research director at the French Research Institute for Development and is presently assigned in Nouméa, New Caledonia, following 3 years in Indonesia. His expertise is primarily on remote sensing of coral reefs, but he now supervises more integrated research projects on coral reef fisheries, pearl farming, and spatial planning in a variety of sites. He particularly enjoys working on atolls of the Pacific Ocean, with about 70 publications just for this topic since 2000. Today, he will draw a rapid panorama of IRD activities related to climate change and islands in the Pacific Ocean. Serge, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you for inviting me to this celebration of the Paris Agreement. I don't know if you see the slides yet. This is my screen. Okay. Okay, thank you. So yeah, we have a little time, so I will just make a brief overview of activities from our institute here in Nouméa in terms of science, policy, and management of Pacific Island in the context of climate change. Next slide, please, Camille. Yeah, just a few words for IRD. So we are based in New Caledonia, where you got a quite big campus next to SPC, Pacific Community. And we see it as a research campus and a regional platform to implement science and apply science for regional international partnership too, throughout in Oceania. Next slide, please. I go quickly to presentation of IAD. Very briefly, so IAD is a French institute that represents about 2,000 researchers. The main characteristics is we work mostly on the tropical belt in developing countries and the French overseas territories. And for that, you have that big center in Nouméa and a much smaller representations in French Polynesia. Next slide, please. Yeah, in Nouméa, there's a variety of activities. Total, when we can have students, which is not the case this year with COVID, we represent about 200 people working on that center. And the activity with a link to climate change is everything that look at the tropical Pacific Ocean and its dynamics, terrestrial and marine biodiversity and the impact of climate change on this biodiversity. But also you got some research program on the socio-environmental dynamics and adaptation of communities to global change. And there's a fair bit of activity into the modeling of vector-borne disease through the influence of climate too. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can see well the ellipse, the bubbles. So our main activity in terms of partnership is through Melanesia, Vanuatu, Fiji, PNG, where we got staff there, and also in Polynesia, where we work in French Polynesia and Cook Island. But we don't have any direct activity in Micronesia or in Marshall, except through the participation of into regional programs which are led by SPC, and in which some of our staff, like in climate modeling or fishery staff, are involved too, but not direct work or field work in Micronesia or Marshall so far. Thank you. Next slide. And so now I'm going to very briefly show 3 examples of application in terms of science, in terms of policy, how we are involved into drafting white papers for the countries and into concrete management of atolls. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the type of modeling that is taking place by the climate modeling team here in Nouméa. Maybe you don't know that, but most of the IPCC models that are used to make a projection in the future are fairly inaccurate for the Pacific. So you first have to make a corrections of this model that the modeling team is doing here before being able to do any relevant projection. And there are a lot of different aspects to that: temperature, wind, waves, etc. And this is an example here for rainfall projection. For example, after correction of the model, if you run the business as usual scenario by 2080, you can see that the projection suggests an increase in rainfall in Marshall Island and Micronesia, especially in December, February, March in the future, which may be good news compared to what we just heard in terms of water security. Of course, this is just modeling, but these models are better than the usual ones because they represent much better the present situation than IPCC models. So the level of trust is slightly higher. Of course, the future will tell what's happening. But there's a lot of activities like this, for example, also projecting temperature and how this is related to fisheries, tuna fisheries, etc. Next slide, please. In terms of policy making, so IAD is involved, not just IAD, but many institutions like SPC or SPREP in the Pacific. And last year, for example, there was a large workshops organized around biodiversity and actions needed in Oceania against climate change related to biodiversity, service, and climate change mitigation. So from this, you got this book, Perry and Vidal 2019, which make a series of recommendations which are endorsed by scientists, government, and international organizations related to biodiversity resources, protected areas, governance, and strong aspects with customary laws and customary habits, cultural values, etc., into these white papers. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of management, so Marshall Island, as half of Micronesia, is made, Marshall is just a country made only of atolls, like you can see here, this map. Next slide, please. It's a bit slow between slides, but this is two Marshall Islands, Rongelap and Isling-Guinea. You can see the structure and maps that we have done in the past. And we're doing a lot of work on these atolls, but not in Micronesia. Next slide, please. But rather in French Polynesia and Cook Island. There's probably a lot of things that could be done similarly in Micronesia. So specifically at the moment, we're involved in a large project where we're leading a large project in French Polynesia about the management of black pearl farming in atolls. So black pearl farming is the second source of income of French Polynesia, and it takes place directly in the lagoon. So the lagoon is exposed, of course, to the productivity of the lagoon, how the oysters are growing and behaving, is modeled against the climate, present climate, but also we got projection for future climate to see where, for example, the population of oyster will evolve and how the activity can evolve also. Next slide, please. So our focus for this project is the Central Pacific Ocean, Cook and French Polynesia. You can see on the insert on the upper left where Marshall is, or New Caledonia. But on the box that you see on the planet Earth, we model the present wind conditions, which can be summarized into four main regimes of wind, from trade winds to other variations, which are characterized by the strength of the wind, the direction, etc. And through model projection in the future, we represent in 2100 what's going to be the conditions of wind, the new wave regimes in the future. And the last line of figures show the difference. And from this projection, we can assess how the hydrodynamic condition of atolls will change. If this, what could be the influence on the equilibrium of these ecosystems, and what can be the implication for pearl farming, and if there is any concrete recommendations to do and to provide to the managers. Next slide, please. And the last one, I think. Yeah, so through this brief presentation, considering the time allowed, I just want to reemphasize that in the climate change context, Marshall Islands, of course, is one of the countries where we work on. It has many similar characteristics and similar environmental and social priorities than IRD traditional working sites in the Pacific Ocean. Of course, IRD was involved into the Paris Agreement, running workshops and things like that during the COP21. And since the Paris Agreement, it's a high priority for research team in IRD to cope with climate change and make programs relevant for climate change, especially for islands in the Pacific through that Nouméa Center. As I said, we work mostly in Melanesia and Polynesia, maybe in the future in Micronesia. And I conclude here by this map of Majuro Island in the Marshall. Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Serge. Thank you for sharing the IRD's efforts in supporting climate resiliency and protecting biodiversity and the marine environment of the Marshall Islands. Of course, we can't stress enough that the valuable role that scientists and researchers play in the global climate effort. So now let us continue with our next speaker. Mr. Espen Roneberg has 28 years of experience working on sustainable development issues, ranging from international negotiations, project development, planning and implementation, to policy formulation. He has been the climate change advisor at the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP, in Apia, Samoa since 2006. Having been involved in climate change negotiations since 1992, he served as Vice President of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC at Kyoto and Buenos Aires from 1997 to 1999, and as co-chairman of the UNFCCC Working Group on Compliance from 1998 to 1999. He has also worked on several practical climate change related projects in the Pacific, including in the Marshall Islands, and provided advice to the small island developing states on climate change and sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Mr. Espen Roneberg.
Thank you very much, Camille. At the outset, let me apologize in case you hear any chickens or children in the background, because I'm calling in from home here in Apia. If you could go to the first slide, maybe go to the second slide right away. So, Yakualo, and thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this important event. As a Marshall Island citizen, it is a particular honor to be asked to do so. I will speak to some examples of concrete actions for climate change and how Marshall Islands has worked diligently to come forward with solutions. I'll also provide a couple of slides on information about SPREP. So you could probably go to slide number 3 or 4, actually. Ah, it went off. Next slide. I just go to the next one. Next one. Next slide, please. Let me just continue. From the very beginning of the climate change negotiations, you mentioned I started in '92. Marshall Islands has been dedicated to environmental integrity and justice, not just for our island communities. Next slide, please. But also for other vulnerable communities. So working with other Alliance of Small Island States members, Marshall Islands had helped frame the precautionary and other fundamental principles of the Climate Convention and also other related conventions, always guided by the science, and have been very, very clear on these principles from the very time that I came on board in '92. With clarity, RMI have always recognized the need to balance mitigation and adaptation, and more so the need for appropriate technology to be deployed and for financing to be provided to the most vulnerable of communities such as ours. Next slide, please. A bit of a delay here. Oh, yes, indeed. And yes, Kathy, that's your grandfather in the middle. In my view, the Marshall Islands has shown not only fortitude in pursuing climate change ambition, but has also shown the highest degree what ambition should look like. Next slide, please. I'd like to highlight some of the specific support that we have provided to Marshall Islands that may be of particular interest to this meeting. So SPREP supported RMI with the development of its first national communication to the UNFCCC, which actually led to the creation of the climate change team. Now, this was the basis for the current and evolving climate change infrastructure within the RMI government. Also arising from this project, we supported a renewable energy resource assessment, which is one of the bases for the RMI NDC. And we also supported the innovative work of RMI under the Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change project, whereby parts of the airport water catchment was relined and covered. Next slide, please. This project reduced evaporation from the reservoir, but it also greatly increased the catchment area. Next slide, please. You're going to have to click through the, yeah. So there you see the covering. There's actually small pumps on the cover of the reservoir, which therefore increases the amount of catchment. If you click through the photos to the next part. So moving to our current support to the Marshall Islands, we're working to assist them with enhancing the NDC and delivery of that NDC as part of the Pacific NDC Hub, of which SPREP is a partner. We're looking at ensuring that there's full understanding on the monitoring and verification requirements, but also that there's capacity building around those requirements provided to RMI. So looking at the details of the NDC reporting, for example, and what's actually needed in terms of capacity to meet those needs. In addition, we're also working with RMI on accessing readiness funds from the Green Climate Fund and on strengthening the national focal point for finance. You can move on. I've seen that picture too many times. This will allow RMI to prepare their priority listing of needed adaptation actions for financing, which will have to include an implementation plan and a timeline for activities. Now, this is still work in progress, but in our view, it's very important that we support Marshall Islands in making their submissions to the Green Climate Fund to receive the resources that they so desperately need for strengthening capacity on the home front. Next slide, please. I think you could probably click through a few more. Next slide, please. Well, I just wanted to conclude and wanted to touch on some of the issues of capacity constraints, which are not just an issue for the Marshall Islands, but for the Pacific as a whole. Most of the countries, I mean, all the countries really are generally short on human resources, in particular the sort of specialized skill sets that you need to develop projects for funding. And the requirements by many of the funds are also highly work intensive. And there's often a lack of understanding from the funds of the situation in countries like Marshall Islands. For example, the cost of transportations to the outer islands of personnel and equipment is very often questioned by the JEF, the GCF, and the Adaptation Fund. Next slide, please. So regional organizations like SPREP, we've been trying our best to provide a level of capacity supplementation, but obviously much more needs to be done. And we're obviously interested to talk to partner organizations and countries on how we can improve on these matters. And working together in genuine and durable partnerships, as the Samoa Pathway says, we feel that maybe we can do better moving forward. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting SPREP to provide some points to this discussion. And thank you very much. Komaldata, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Espen, for that very clear and very precise presentation outlining SPREP support for the Marshall Islands, as well as the specific challenges and gaps that still have yet to be filled. So we move on to our second to the last speaker. This is actually going quite fast, even though we've tackled a lot of different presentations already. So we move on to Ms. Caroline Edant. is a graduate of Sciences Po Paris and holds a master's degree in engineering and environmental management from Mines Paris Tech. She is currently a biodiversity and climate policy officer at the French Development Agency's Pacific Ocean Regional Office in Nouméa in New Caledonia. She joined AFD's headquarters in Paris in 2014 as a senior climate expert. She previously spent 7 years at International Public Transit Operator, Transdev, as a climate expert and worked as a sustainable development consultant for a private equity firm in Chile. To present the actions of the French Development Agency in the Pacific region, please welcome Ms. Caroline Edant.
Thank you, Camille. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, and I would like to thank the organizer for giving us the opportunity to present a new tool for climate adaptation for the Pacific. So I have some slides. Before presenting the Kiwa initiative, this new multi-donors initiative, I would like to say a few words on who is the Agence Française de Développement, the French Development Agency, AFD, because we are not very well known. So this is my first slide. Yeah, so who is the AFD? We are a public and financing institution with banking activities that implements France's official development assistance policy. And our mission is to contribute to the economic, social, and environmental progress of very low and middle income countries. And we are also present in the French overseas territories. We are a public institution. We are fully publicly owned institution, but AFD is a legal and autonomous entity distinct from the state. Still, we receive our mandates from our line ministries, which are the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the French Ministry for Economy, and the Overseas Ministry for Overseas Territories. We are involved in more than 4,000 projects and in more than 115 countries and French overseas territories. In 2019, our financial commitment amounted more than 14 billion euros. As a banking institution, our mission is carried out by providing loans, but we also provide grants that comes from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also from the Ministry of Overseas Territories. And we also provide expertise and technical assistance. Can we move to the next slide, please? We have agencies all across the world. We have 85 agencies, and we can have financial commitment in very type of sectors. So we can support projects in the transport sector, the water sanitation, agriculture, education, health. So a very broad range of sectors. Next slide, please. In the Pacific, we have two offices. We have an office here in New Caledonia, where I'm based, in Nouméa. This is the office for our activities in New Caledonia, but it is also the headquarters of our regional office for the Pacific. So from Nouméa, we oversee the activities of our office in French Polynesia, in Papeete, and in the 15 Pacific Island countries. And we are also active in Wallis and Futuna. Since 2018, AFD can intervene on adaptation to climate change and biodiversity conservation in the 14 Pacific Island countries, Timor-Leste, and the French territories. So we have a specific mandate on climate change adaptation and biodiversity in the Pacific. AFD is a development bank which is committed to merge climate and biodiversity into a single ambition. We set a new objective, that is to say that 30% of AFD's climate finance will benefit biodiversity by 2025. And between 2020 and 2025, AFD will double its financing for biodiversity. And AFD also integrated climate into its operation more than 10 years ago. And today we have a goal of reaching 5 billion euros in climate finance annually by 2020. And last year it was more. We reached 6.1 billion euros. And of this amount, 1.5 million is for climate change adaptation. And we also have another strong commitment, that is that at least 50% of our annual financial commitment must have climate co-benefits. And here you will see our financial commitment for biodiversity and climate finance, so more than 6.1 billion in 2019. Next slide, please. So at AFD, we strongly believe that nature-based solutions are part of the solution for addressing climate change adaptation issue. IUCN define NBS as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges such as climate change effectively and adaptively. So a number of experiments have shown that natural resources can serve to protect communities and ecosystems from climate change by, for example, the restoration of coastal ecosystems. And today, scientific evidence shows that at least 30% of climate change solutions are nature-based, but only 2% of international climate finance currently benefits biodiversity and ecosystems. So there is a huge gap to fill by investing more on climate finance toward biodiversity. So that's why, next slide, please. We launched a new initiative with a group of donors. So this initiative is called the KIO initiative. The launch was this year in 2020, together with the European Union. And we especially work with the EU delegation in Suva, with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So this is a new initiative of 35 million euros in grants. This initiative was announced by our French President Emmanuel Macron at the 2017 One Planet Summit. And it was at the beginning a Franco-European initiative, and then the other donors joined the initiative. So the objective is to strengthen resilience to climate change through biodiversity conservation for Pacific Island countries. You will see here the link of our website, where we have a dedicated page on Kiwa, where there will all the information available on the initiative. Next slide, please. So here you will see the contribution of each donor. And this is the first time that these 5 donors work together around a common objective for the Pacific. Next slide, please. So the objective of this initiative is to catalyze and streamline funding from donors on projects related to climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation. We hope to simplify access to funds for project developers. We will be aligned with regional and national priorities. And the objective also is to foster the regional cooperation between ACP countries and OCTs. And why we can do this is because we receive from the French Ministries of Overseas Territories a specific budget for the French territories. So that's why we are able to finance both ODA eligible countries and OCTs, French OCTs. Next slide, please. So we have several components. The first one, which is a component which is called A, but it's a call for projects for very small grant to a medium grant. This component will be managed by IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the office based in Suva. And there will be 3 types of grants between 25,000 euro to up to 50,000 euro, and a small grant and then medium grants. For who? It will be local civil society, international NGOs, local and national authorities. And for international NGOs, they will be eligible only if the local and national authorities give their approval, and if there are also if there is a local NGOs working with them. Then we have a component for regional projects, and that include a capacity building envelope. This capacity building envelope will be managed by SPREP and SPC, the Pacific Community, and the objective is that for SPREP and SPC to help their member states and French and territories members to develop, identify and develop projects to be submitted to the Kiwa initiative, and then to help them to implement the projects. Then we have a project component for regional projects, and for large projects from 1.5 million euro up to 5 million euros. And the beneficiaries will be the local and national authorities, regional organizations such as SPC and SPREP, and international NGOs. And then AFD is responsible for implementing all the funds of the initiative. This is the Nouméa office in charge of doing this. And we will be helped by a secretariat that is now starting to work now in December to implement the fund. Next slide, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, Carolyn. If we can move a little faster so we can end on time, because
Yes.
we have one last speaker.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So just on the governance, just a quick word that I would say that we created specific governance for approving the project with the donors participating, and soon we'll have also picked representatives. Next slide, please. So the eligibility criteria for so here I give all the appraisal process and how to submit the project for the regional component projects. And next slide. So the eligibility criteria, so each submitted project will have to meet the biodiversity conservation and adaptation climate change criteria. So it will be key to demonstrate what are the climate impacts in the countries that will benefit from the project, and how the activities that will be financed will help to reduce the climate vulnerabilities through nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So the countries which are eligible are ODA eligible countries in the Pacific. So that include Marshall Islands. And so today it's 18 countries and French territories. And a gender approach will be mandatory in each project, and also an analysis of social and environmental impact in the concept notes. Next slide, please. So the next step, IUCN will launch its first call for project in early 2021, around April. So they will put all the information on the website, and of course, AV also will put information on our website. The one-stop shop for regional project is already operational, and the next call for ideas will be in the second semester of 2021, and project developers are invited to fill in concept notes. And the concept note model is available on our website. And here in Nouméa, we are at the disposal of project developer to discuss with them about their ideas, or if they want to send us a first draft of concept note, we are here to help them and to make some comments. So that was the few words I wanted to say on the initiative. Next slide is only our contact details, my details here in Nouméa, and also from the Secretariat. So again, thanks a lot for this opportunity to present this Q initiative. And here, so you will see the logo of all the donors and the partners.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Caroline.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. The actions of the AFD in the Pacific clearly illustrate France's support for capacity building and resiliency for island states. And hopefully we have several organizations and actors who would take part and take advantage of the Kiwa initiative of the AFD. So thank you very much. And now we are on our last speaker of the program, who is joining us from Berlin. And I understand that it's very, very early there. So we thank him for being able to join us despite the large time difference. Mr. Dominik Borowski is currently based in the Pacific region and heads the German Corporation for International Cooperation, or GIS's Low Carbon Sea Transport Project. From 2012 to 2013, he developed GIS's sustainable transport portfolio in China. He had previously worked with the German government in implementing policies for electric mobility and new mobility, and was involved with GIS's cooperation with the automotive sector. Please welcome Mr. Dominik Borowski, joining us from Berlin. Dominik.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to present Germany's engagement on climate protection in the Marshall Islands. This project, Low Carbon Sea Transport, focusing on the emissions from RMI's maritime sector, has been established by Tony de Broom and Germany's Minister for the Environment during the Paris COP. So I think that's that also marks the 5th anniversary. Myself, I'm with GIZ, which is to some extent the German counterpart of AFD in Germany, and normally based in Suva, due to the pandemic currently in Berlin, but I am returning back to Suva after Christmas. Next slide, please. Yes, so the general goal or target of this project is mitigation, the reduction of CO2 emission in Pacific Island countries from the transport sector. And we started, we have 3 work streams. We started in 2017 on the inside lagoon transport. This is what we call the traditional canoes, where we do training, capacity development, and prototyping. Then the second pillar is, we call it inter-atoll transport, which targets the fleet, the state-owned fleet of RMI, where we retrofit and new build vessels. And the third work stream, most current run, is the high-level policy support at UNFCCC and IMO negotiations for RMI and also other Pacific Island countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we have an active partner setting. It is a bilateral project between the Federal Ministry for the Environment in Germany and the government of RMI. We are partnering with the Ministry of Transportation, RMI, but also with the Ministry on Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of Education. We have the Canoes of Marshall Islands as an active NGO. We have the Marshall Island Shipping Corporation as the state-owned shipping corporation in RMI, and in Germany, the technical partner, that's the University of Applied Sciences Emden-Leer, and Independent Diplomat as the advisory group for the policy support. Our team, which you see on the left side, is based in Majuro and Suva. and now we are five staff in total. Next, please. So on the output level, we are supporting the NDC targets, the availability of cost-efficient sea transport, and also enhancing the capacities for low-carbon sea transport in RMI. And we see that RMI is leading in sustainable sea transport in the Pacific Islands, and is also on a good way to improve its local sea transport and education system. Next slide, please. Yes, what do we have achieved so far? So in the Inside Lagoon area, we have conducted a boat building workshop where we built 3 prototypes, which you see on the picture. The next boat building workshop is happening in January next year, and the idea is to use the traditional canoe heritage, boat building heritage in the Marshall Islands with new materials and new building techniques. Next slide. Yes, I think there are lots of pictures. This is why it's changing slowly. Here you see some more pictures of our prototypes of the catamaran and the proa, and the team of in the NGO Canoes of Marshall Islands, WAM, building the canoes together with boat builders from Australia and Germany. On the larger vessels, we are currently designing a low emission sailing cargo freighter, which will have a 80% reduction of emissions, and will be built next year. Right now, we have chartered also the sailing vessel Kwai, which is a private-owned sail freighter, which is right now servicing the atolls in the Marshall Islands, and most likely will be after the charter will be procured by the government of the Marshall Islands, serving as the first low carbon vessel in RMI. Yes, and on the level of policy support, we are supporting the government of the Marshall Islands in UNFCCC and IMO negotiations. Within the IMO, the climate protection work is being done in the MEPC meetings and in the intersessional working groups. We also took over the initiative from the EU to support Pacific Island countries which are engaged in the High Ambition Coalition on shipping. As soon as traveling will be back on again, we are organizing and supporting the participation of the delegates in the relevant meetings in London and Brussels. And thank you. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominic, for joining us today and for sharing with us the work of Germany to support the RMI and the Pacific region. And with that, we conclude today's program. Thank you very much for all the speakers for taking time today to join us for this special occasion to share existing efforts in the collective fight against climate change. I think a recurring message throughout the program is not only the need to continue our climate efforts, but to initiate new efforts and to intensify existing ones, both for developing and developed countries, in order for us to achieve a truly sustainable future for the next generations and to be able to fully achieve the targets, objective, and the spirit of the Paris Agreement. So to end today's event, I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a little gesture. So I mentioned this earlier in the program where we would hold a 5 sign on our screen, like that. And together we would say, all together for the climate. Okay, so on my count, ready? 1, 2, 3. All together for the climate. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
Camille.
thank you.
Have a great
Yes.
day.